The fastest way to reveal a person's character isn't to give them power. It's to let them believe no one understands what they're saying. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian cast warm reflections across polished marble floors as Manhattan's elite filled the dining room with quiet conversations and the soft clink of expensive glassware. Outside, rain traced silver lines down the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. Inside, every table seemed occupied by people who measured time in acquisitions, mergers, and private flights. Emily Carter moved between them unnoticed, which was exactly how she preferred it. At 28, Emily had mastered the art of becoming invisible. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back beneath the restaurant's dress code requirements. Her black uniform was pressed. Her smile was polite, efficient, forgettable. Most customers never looked at her long enough to remember her face. They remembered the wine, the service, the perfectly timed refills. But not her. Tonight had already been a long shift. Nearly 10 hours on her feet. 3 private parties. 1 difficult customer. 2 large corporate reservations. And still another 3 hours before she could take the subway home to Queens. Yet despite the exhaustion behind her blue eyes, she carried herself with the same calm dignity she always did. No complaints. No shortcuts. No drama. Emily. The restaurant manager appeared beside her. Table 12 just arrived. VIP clients. Mr. Alexander Hayes. Several servers exchanged glances. The name carried weight. Everyone in New York knew Alexander Hayes. Founder of Hayes Technologies. Billionaire. Magazine covers. Television interviews. The kind of man whose decisions moved markets. Emily simply nodded. Got it. Just be careful, another waitress whispered. He's not exactly known for patience. Emily smiled faintly. Most people aren't. Across the room, Alexander Hayes entered with 3 international business partners. The energy changed instantly. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Even the staff straightened a little. At 39, Alexander had the presence that came from years of success. Tall, sharp suit, expensive watch. The confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in every room. He barely glanced around before taking his seat. His attention remained fixed on the men accompanying him. One was clearly American. The other 2 appeared Middle Eastern. Their discussion had already begun before they even sat down. Emily approached carrying menus. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the Grand Meridian. My name is Emily, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Alexander accepted the menu without looking up. Sparkling water. Of course, sir. The others placed similar orders. Professional. Routine. Nothing unusual. Emily turned to leave when one of the Middle Eastern executives made a comment in Arabic. The men laughed quietly. Alexander responded immediately in the same language. Fluent. Confident. The conversation continued as though she wasn't standing there. Emily remained still for half a second. Then she lowered her eyes and continued toward the service station. Behind her, the laughter grew slightly louder. A few moments later, she returned with their drinks. As she carefully placed a glass beside Alexander, a small disturbance at a nearby table distracted her for an instant. The sparkling water tilted slightly. A single drop landed near his sleeve. Not on the suit. Not even touching it. Just beside it. Yet the expression on Alexander's face hardened immediately. Emily reached for a napkin. I'm sorry, sir. Before she could finish, one of the businessmen spoke in Arabic. Another laughed. Alexander leaned back in his chair and answered in the same language. This time the words were slower, deliberate, meant to entertain his companions. The men smiled. One shook his head. Another chuckled into his drink. To everyone else in the restaurant, it sounded like ordinary conversation. Foreign words floating harmlessly above expensive plates. But Emily understood every syllable. Alexander's voice remained calm as he said, "At least she's prettier than she is intelligent. Though that's not a particularly high bar." The table laughed again. Emily's hand tightened around the tray. Only slightly. Barely noticeable. Her expression never changed. She simply placed the final glass onto the table. "Anything else I can bring you, gentlemen?" Alexander finally looked directly at her. For the first time all evening, his eyes carried the casual indifference of someone who assumed she understood nothing. "No," he said. "That'll be all." Emily smiled politely. "Enjoy your evening." Then she walked away. Calm. Professional. Unbothered. At least on the surface. Because something neither Alexander Hayes nor anyone else in that restaurant knew was that Emily Carter had understood every word. And somewhere beyond the glow of chandeliers and the comfort of million-dollar conversations, a storm was already beginning to form. Emily pushed through the kitchen doors and into the controlled chaos behind the dining room. Orders were being called. Plates moved beneath bright lights. Steam rose from stainless steel counters. Yet for the first time that evening, the noise seemed distant. The words still echoed in her mind. Not because they hurt. She had heard worse over the years. What surprised her was how familiar the situation felt. Different city, different restaurant, different billionaire. The same assumption. People often revealed their true character when they believed no one could understand them. Emily set down her tray and began organizing drink tickets. Her movements remained steady, professional, measured, the way they always were. A line cook named Omar glanced up from the grill. 52 years old, born in Jordan, and one of the few people in the restaurant who noticed details others missed. He watched Emily for a moment before speaking. "You heard them, did you not?" Emily paused briefly. Only briefly. Then she continued sorting receipts. "I do not know what you mean." Omar smiled without looking away from the sizzling steaks. "You understood every word." Emily finally looked up. Omar switched effortlessly into Arabic. "The accent gave you away." A faint smile touched her lips. Was it that obvious? Only to someone listening carefully. He lowered his voice. "Most people never do." Emily glanced toward the dining room entrance. Through the narrow window, she could see Alexander Hayes laughing with his guests. Confident, relaxed, completely unaware. "It does not matter," she said quietly. Omar followed her gaze. "Maybe not. But something tells me tonight is not over." Before Emily could answer, another server rushed into the kitchen carrying an empty wine tray. "Table 12 is asking for the reserve wine list." Omar raised an eyebrow. "The important table." Emily nodded. "Apparently." She grabbed a leather wine menu and headed back toward the dining room. The atmosphere had shifted slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. But Emily noticed. One of the Middle Eastern executives no longer seemed comfortable. His smile had faded. The conversation around the table carried a subtle tension now. A tension hidden beneath expensive suits and polite business manners. Emily approached and placed the wine list beside Alexander. "Your reserve selections, sir." "Thank you." He barely looked at her. Again. Yet this time Emily noticed something else. Several documents had been spread across the table. Legal papers, contract summaries, financial projections, the type of paperwork that accompanied major acquisitions. One page had been separated from the rest. A translated document. Arabic on one side, English on the other. The executive seated across from Alexander tapped a paragraph and spoke quickly. Another executive responded. Their voices remained calm, professional, yet the exchange felt increasingly strained. Emily stepped away, but as she did, a single phrase drifted across the table. One sentence, barely audible. "Enough." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not because she was confused, because she understood exactly what had been said. The English translation on the page was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not enough to be obvious, but enough to change meaning, enough to create a problem. Emily continued walking. Her heartbeat remained steady. She had spent years training herself not to react. Still, something about the document bothered her. A server passed by carrying appetizers. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine." "You look distracted." Emily glanced once more toward table 12. Alexander appeared completely focused on the negotiation, confident that everything was proceeding according to plan, confident that the translation was accurate, confident that the experts around him knew exactly what they were doing. Emily looked away. The easiest thing would be to ignore it. Finish her shift. Go home. Let people solve their own problems. That was what most people would do. But deep down she already knew she would not. Because there was something else Alexander Hayes did not know. The woman he had dismissed as an uneducated waitress had spent years studying the language, culture, and legal terminology appearing on the very document sitting in front of him. And from what she had just overheard, a mistake was quietly moving across that table. A mistake worth far more than anyone in the room realized. Emily tried to focus on the tasks in front of her. Table 7 needed dessert menus. Table 4 wanted another round of coffee. A private party in the back room had requested extra place settings. Normally, work helped her clear her mind. Tonight it did the opposite. Every time she glanced toward table 12, the same document caught her attention. The same paragraph. The same mistake. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The rain outside grew heavier, turning the city lights beyond the windows into blurred ribbons of gold and white. Inside, the negotiation continued. Voices remained calm. Smiles appeared and disappeared. Glasses were refilled. Yet beneath the polished surface, tension continued building. Alexander Hayes sat at the center of it all, confident, focused, certain he was guiding the conversation exactly where he wanted it to go. That certainty worried Emily more than anything. People were most vulnerable when they believed they had complete control. She carried a tray of appetizers toward the table. As she approached, one of the executives pointed to a section of the contract again. Another exchanged a quick look with his colleague. It lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. Emily did not. Years ago, one of her professors had taught her something she never forgot. Words mattered, but expressions mattered more. People often revealed the truth in the space between sentences. She placed the plates carefully in front of each guest. "Your appetizers, gentlemen." One of the visitors thanked her. In Arabic. Instinctively, Emily nodded before she could stop herself. The executive noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly. Just slightly. Then he returned his attention to the conversation. Emily stepped away immediately. Her heart sank. She had been careful all evening. Too careful to make a mistake like that. Back in the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water. Omar was preparing another order when he noticed her expression. Something is wrong. Emily stared through the small kitchen window toward the dining room. The translation. Omar stopped working. Still bothering you? It is not just bothering me. She lowered her voice. It changes the obligation clause. Omar frowned. By how much? Emily hesitated. Potentially tens of millions of dollars over the life of the agreement. The older chef slowly set down his knife. And they do not see it. No. What about their lawyers? Emily looked back toward the table. Apparently not. Omar let out a long breath. Then maybe you should say something. Emily almost laughed. To a billionaire who thinks I am too unintelligent to understand basic conversation? Omar's eyes softened. Not for him. Then for who? For yourself. The answer lingered in the air long after he returned to work. For yourself. Emily had spent years staying invisible. It was safer that way. Simpler. The fewer people knew, the fewer questions they asked. Yet tonight felt different. Because this was no longer about an insult. It was not about pride. It was about watching a preventable mistake unfold in real time. Meanwhile, at table 12, Alexander felt frustration beginning to creep into the discussion. Something was off. The numbers worked. The projections worked. The legal team had reviewed everything repeatedly. Yet the two executives across from him seemed increasingly hesitant. One kept rereading the same paragraph. Another whispered something in Arabic before leaning back in his chair. Alexander hated uncertainty. He built his empire by eliminating it. Is there a concern? He finally asked. The executives exchanged another look. Perhaps only a misunderstanding, one replied carefully. Alexander frowned. A misunderstanding about what? The executive glanced toward the contract. Then toward the translation. Then, unexpectedly, toward the far side of the room where Emily was serving another table. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. And in that instant, Emily realized something important. She was not the only person in the restaurant who knew there was a problem. Someone else had noticed it too. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Across the dining room, the executive's gaze lingered on Emily for barely a second before returning to the contract. Yet that second was enough. Enough for her to recognize the look. It was the expression of someone who knew there was a problem but was not certain how to solve it. Emily lowered her eyes and continued serving another table. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inside, the pressure continued building. At table 12, Alexander Hayes leaned forward. If there is a concern, I would rather discuss it directly. His tone remained professional, but impatience was beginning to surface. One of the executives adjusted his glasses and glanced again at the translated document. There appears to be some ambiguity. Alexander frowned. Our legal team reviewed every page. Of course. The executive offered a polite smile. Yet sometimes language carries meaning beyond direct translation. Alexander followed the man's gaze toward the contract. Then let us clarify it now. The conversation resumed, but the rhythm had changed. The confidence that had filled the table earlier was slowly fading. Questions appeared where certainty had existed. Clarifications led to further clarifications. Small details suddenly felt larger. Meanwhile, Emily stood beside the service station pretending to review orders while quietly listening. Not to private information, to tone, to hesitation, to uncertainty. Years of language study had taught her something most people never realized. Communication failures rarely began with words. They began with assumptions. Omar stepped out of the kitchen carrying a tray of desserts. As he passed, he spoke softly enough that only Emily could hear. "You still have time." Emily exhaled slowly. "And say what exactly?" "The truth. No one asked for my opinion." Omar looked toward table 12. "Not yet." The words stayed with her. "Not yet." A few minutes later, Alexander signaled for another sparkling water. Emily approached with practiced professionalism. As she placed the glass beside him, the contract remained open on the table. The disputed paragraph sat directly in front of him. For the first time all evening, she saw the full translation clearly. Her concern deepened immediately. The English version described a performance obligation. The Arabic version described a guaranteed commitment. Similar words, very different consequences. The difference could alter expectations for years. Alexander noticed her brief glance toward the page. His expression hardened slightly. "Something interesting?" The question carried a faint edge. The same edge she had heard earlier when he assumed she understood nothing. Emily stepped back politely. "No, sir." Alexander returned his attention to the negotiation. Yet something about her reaction lingered in his mind. It was subtle, almost impossible to define. But he had spent decades reading people. And for a moment, he had the strange feeling that the waitress knew something he did not. The thought irritated him. Across the table, one of the executives spoke again in Arabic. This time the concern was more visible. Another executive responded. Their voices remained respectful, but the uncertainty was unmistakable. Alexander's legal advisor leaned closer to review the documents. Pages turned. Notes were exchanged. Nobody seemed completely satisfied. The negotiation that should have been approaching its conclusion now felt stalled. The dining room around them continued as normal. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked. A piano melody drifted softly through the restaurant. Yet at table 12, momentum was slipping away. Emily watched from a distance. The easiest choice remained silence. Finish the shift. Collect her paycheck. Go home. Let powerful people solve powerful problems. But every passing minute made that choice harder. Because she already knew exactly where the misunderstanding lived. Exactly which sentence had created it. Exactly how easily it could be corrected. Then something unexpected happened. The executive who had noticed her earlier quietly closed his folder and looked directly across the room. Not at Alexander. Not at the lawyers. At Emily. His expression remained calm. Respectful. Almost questioning. As though he were silently asking whether she saw the same mistake he did. Emily felt her pulse quicken. For the first time all evening, she realized the situation was no longer moving toward a solution. It was moving toward a breakdown. And if nobody spoke up soon, the entire agreement might begin to unravel. The next 10 minutes felt longer than the previous 2 hours. The discussion at table 12 continued circling the same paragraph. Questions produced more questions. Clarifications created fresh uncertainty. One executive reviewed the Arabic version again. Another studied the English translation. Alexander listened carefully, but the confidence that had defined his posture earlier was beginning to fade. He hated wasted time. He hated unresolved problems even more. Emily stood near the service station, pretending to organize menus while her mind replayed the wording she had seen. The issue was obvious to her, painfully obvious. Yet she remained silent, not because she doubted herself, because she understood exactly how ridiculous it would sound. A waitress interrupting a room full of executives, attorneys, and international investors. A waitress correcting people whose annual salaries exceeded what she earned in years. The thought alone seemed absurd. Then the executive who had noticed her before slowly closed the contract. He spoke calmly in Arabic. This time his voice carried unmistakable concern. Emily understood every word. The agreement could not proceed until the language discrepancy was resolved. Across the table, another executive agreed. Alexander's legal advisor frowned. We have reviewed that clause repeatedly. Then perhaps, one of the visitors replied. The review missed something. Silence settled over the table. Not dramatic silence. The dangerous kind. The kind that appears when nobody has an answer. Alexander leaned back and rubbed his temple. For the first time that evening, frustration showed openly. There has to be a solution. Nobody responded immediately. The executive glanced across the dining room again, directly toward Emily. Then he did something unexpected. He raised his hand slightly. Mississippi. Emily looked up. Several heads turned toward her. Would you come here for a moment? The dining room suddenly felt much quieter. Emily froze. Not visibly, only internally. Every instinct told her to refuse politely and continue working. Yet something in the executive's expression stopped her. It was not arrogance. It was curiosity. Respectful curiosity. She approached the table carefully. How may I help you, sir? The executive studied her for a second. Earlier, when I thanked you in Arabic, you understood me. Alexander's eyes shifted toward her immediately. Emily felt every person at the table watching. A little, she answered carefully. The executive smiled faintly. A little. His tone suggested he did not believe that for a moment. Alexander's legal advisor looked confused. One of the executives exchanged a knowing glance with another. The room seemed to hold its breath. Emily remained calm. I have some familiarity with the language. The executive nodded slowly. Then he turned the contract toward her. Would you mind reading this sentence? Alexander stared at him. You cannot be serious. The executive never looked away from Emily. Humor me. For a moment nobody moved. The chandeliers glowed overhead. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere in the restaurant, a wine glass touched a plate. The sound seemed unusually loud. Emily looked down at the document. The sentence she had worried about all evening sat directly in front of her. She read it once, then twice. Confirmation. The same mistake. Exactly where she expected it to be. Alexander crossed his arms. This is becoming ridiculous. Emily slowly lifted her eyes from the page. She could feel his skepticism. The same skepticism that had shaped every assumption he made about her from the moment she approached the table. Yet she felt no anger, no desire for revenge, only certainty, quiet certainty. The executive spoke gently. Do you see something we do not? Emily looked around the table. At the lawyers, the investors, the billionaire who had dismissed her hours earlier. Then she took a slow breath. Yes, she said softly. I think I do. For a moment, nobody spoke. The words hung above the table like a suspended note in a quiet room. Alexander Hayes stared at Emily as if seeing her for the first time. One of the attorneys looked mildly amused. Another appeared skeptical. The executive who had invited her over simply waited. Emily lowered her eyes to the contract again. Her voice remained calm, soft, professional. The English version says the acquiring company is expected to provide support services under reasonable commercial conditions. She gently touched a line on the Arabic page. But this version does not say expected. It says guaranteed. The executive nodded slowly. Continue. Emily read the sentence aloud in Arabic. Not hesitantly, not carefully, fluently. The words flowed with the ease of someone speaking a language she had known for years. Every syllable landed exactly where it belonged. The reaction was immediate. One attorney straightened in his chair. Another blinked twice. Alexander froze completely. Earlier that evening, he had listened to her take orders. He had heard her apologize for a drop of water. He had heard her speak with customers in ordinary American English. Now he was hearing something entirely different. Something he never expected. Emily continued. In legal Arabic, this wording creates an unconditional obligation rather than a performance objective. That changes the interpretation of risk exposure. Silence. Complete silence. Even the executive who had asked for her opinion seemed impressed. Alexander slowly looked at the document, then at Emily, then back at the document. You are saying the translation is wrong? Emily shook her head slightly. Not exactly wrong. In everyday conversation, both versions sound similar. In a legal agreement worth hundreds of millions of dollars, they are very different. One of the attorneys immediately leaned forward and reviewed the clause. Again, this time much more carefully. He compared both pages side by side. 30 seconds passed. Then 60. Finally, he exhaled. She is right. The words landed heavily. Another attorney took the document. He reviewed it independently. Then he nodded. She is absolutely right. Across the table, the Middle Eastern executives exchanged glances. Not surprised. Relieved. One of them smiled for the first time all evening. This is exactly what we have been trying to explain. Alexander said nothing. The billionaire who had spent his career identifying opportunities before everyone else suddenly found himself several steps behind a waitress. Emily remained standing quietly beside the table. She showed no sign of triumph, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass anyone. She simply answered the question she had been asked. The executive who first noticed her leaned back in his chair. "Your Arabic is remarkable." Emily smiled politely. "Thank you. Where did you learn?" Another silence followed. This one different. Emily seemed unsure whether to answer. Alexander found himself unexpectedly curious. More curious than he had been about anything all evening. "I studied for several years," she replied. "That is all." The executive laughed softly. "That is all? Most people who study for several years cannot explain legal distinctions that clearly." Emily looked down. "I had good teachers." Alexander could not take his eyes off her. Earlier, he had spoken about her in Arabic because he assumed she understood nothing. Earlier, he had dismissed her before she finished a sentence. Earlier, he had reduced her entire identity to a uniform. Now every assumption felt painfully exposed. One by one, the attorneys began discussing revisions. The atmosphere around the table transformed almost instantly. Tension faded. Momentum returned. Solutions appeared. What had looked like a dead end suddenly seemed manageable. Yet Alexander barely heard any of it, because a different realization occupied his thoughts. The woman standing beside the table had understood every Arabic conversation from the beginning. Every comment, every joke, every assumption, including his own. Slowly he looked up at her. Their eyes met for the first time without hierarchy, without indifference, without distraction. And for the first time that evening, Alexander Hayes felt something he rarely experienced. Not control, not confidence, humility. The energy around the table changed completely. What had started as a stalled negotiation was now moving forward again with renewed confidence. Attorneys revised language. Executives exchanged notes. Clarifications that had seemed impossible 30 minutes earlier suddenly appeared straightforward. Yet the biggest change was not in the contract. It was in the way people looked at Emily. The same woman who had spent most of the evening unnoticed now held the quiet attention of everyone at the table. One of the executives extended his hand toward her. "You saved us hours of confusion." Emily accepted the compliment with a modest nod. "I am glad I could help." Another executive smiled. "More than help." He tapped the contract. "This agreement may not have survived the night without that clarification." Emily seemed uncomfortable with the attention. The attorneys would have found it eventually. The attorneys exchanged amused looks. One of them laughed softly. "Eventually" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Even Alexander allowed a faint smile. The first genuine smile of the evening. Yet his thoughts remained elsewhere. The more he replayed the past few hours, the worse he felt. He remembered every assumption he had made. Every judgment formed before knowing a single thing about her. Across the room, the rain continued falling against the windows, turning Manhattan into a watercolor of lights and reflections. The negotiation resumed, but now the atmosphere felt almost relaxed. One of the Middle Eastern executives looked at Emily thoughtfully. Then his expression shifted. Recognition. Real recognition. "Excuse me," he said suddenly. "May I ask your full name?" Emily hesitated. "Emily Carter." The executive blinked. "Emily Carter?" She nodded. The man leaned back slowly. "That is impossible." Several people looked confused. Alexander frowned. "What is impossible?" The executive continued staring at Emily. 3 years ago, our foundation worked with a translation team on a humanitarian education project in Jordan. Emily's eyes widened slightly. The man continued. "One translator volunteered hundreds of hours when funding disappeared. She helped complete the entire program." A second executive immediately sat forward. "I remember that." He looked directly at Emily. "Emily Carter?" Silence settled over the table once more. Different from before. Softer. More personal. Emily lowered her eyes. "It was a long time ago." The executive shook his head. "Not for the families who benefited." Another nodded in agreement. Thousands of educational materials were distributed because of that work. Alexander watched the exchange carefully. This was becoming a pattern. Every answer about Emily seemed to reveal another question. The executive smiled warmly. "You never told us who you were." Emily looked genuinely surprised. "I was not aware anyone remembered." The men laughed. "We remembered. One of them pointed gently toward the contract. And now I understand why your legal Arabic is so strong. Emily's cheeks colored slightly. She clearly preferred being invisible. Unfortunately for her, that was becoming impossible. Alexander found himself studying her again. Not her appearance, her composure, the remarkable absence of ego. Most people would have seized the moment, explained their accomplishments, collected praise. Emily seemed to be doing everything possible to avoid it. The contrast was striking. One executive finally asked the question everyone else was thinking. If you have these skills, why are you working here? The room grew quiet again. Emily looked toward the rain beyond the windows. For the first time all evening, her confidence seemed to soften. Life changes plans sometimes, she said gently. And family comes first. No further explanation. No dramatic story. No complaints. Just a simple answer delivered with dignity. Yet somehow that made the response more powerful. Alexander felt something shift inside him. Respect. Not because of the languages. Not because of the contract. Because of the quiet strength behind every answer she gave. The negotiation eventually resumed, but Alexander noticed something unusual. Whenever Emily walked away, the conversation seemed to follow her. Not with curiosity about a waitress. With admiration for a person they had all underestimated. Including him. Especially him. The agreement was finally moving toward completion. Revised language had been inserted. Attorneys were satisfied. The executives who had arrived carrying concern now carried relief. What had nearly become an expensive misunderstanding had transformed into a productive evening. Yet Alexander Hayes found it increasingly difficult to focus on the documents in front of him. His attention kept drifting elsewhere. Not toward the contract. Toward the woman who had quietly changed the outcome of the entire meeting. Emily continued working as though nothing unusual had happened. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, delivered desserts. The same calm professionalism, the same measured pace. If someone had entered the restaurant at that moment, they would never have guessed she had just corrected a room full of experts. That fascinated Alexander more than any language skill ever could. Most people spent their lives trying to be noticed. Emily seemed determined to disappear. Nearly an hour later, signatures were finally placed on the revised agreement. Hands were shaken. Smiles returned. The tension that had hovered over the table all evening dissolved into satisfaction. One executive raised his glass. To successful partnerships. The others joined him. Alexander did as well. Yet before the toast ended, one of the executives turned toward Emily once again. And to unexpected experts. Several people laughed warmly. Emily smiled politely from across the room, but quickly returned to her work. Alexander watched her disappear through the kitchen doors. Something about that simple moment stayed with him. When the meeting finally concluded, the executives prepared to leave. Coats were collected. Business cards exchanged. Promises of future collaboration filled the air. Before departing, the executive who recognized Emily approached Alexander privately. "You seem surprised." Alexander gave a quiet laugh. "That obvious?" "Only because I felt the same. Way years ago." The man glanced toward the kitchen entrance. "Some people carry entire worlds inside them. You only discover it if you take the time to listen." Alexander followed his gaze. "How much do you know about her?" "Very little." The executive smiled. "That is what makes it remarkable." Then he added, "The people who helped us back then were volunteers. Most wanted recognition. She never did. She completed her work and disappeared." A few minutes later the executives left, stepping into the rainy Manhattan night. The restaurant slowly returned to normal. Empty tables replaced crowded ones. Conversations faded. Staff began preparing for closing. Alexander remained seated. Alone now. For perhaps the first time in years, he was not thinking about profit margins, quarterly reports, or acquisition strategies. He was thinking about assumptions. The realization was uncomfortable. He had built his reputation on reading situations accurately. Yet tonight he had failed at the simplest assessment of all. He had judged a person without knowing anything about her. Eventually he stood and walked toward the service station. Emily was organizing receipts beneath the warm glow of a small lamp. She looked up as he approached. For a second neither spoke. The sounds of closing time filled the space around them. Silverware being sorted. Chairs being adjusted. Quiet footsteps crossing polished floors. Finally Alexander broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Emily studied him calmly. Not suspicious. Not impressed. Simply listening. Alexander continued. Not because you corrected the contract. Because of how I treated you before that happened. Emily said nothing. The silence encouraged honesty. I assumed things about you that were not true. He glanced down briefly before meeting her eyes again. More than that. I spoke carelessly because I believed there would be no consequences. Emily remained quiet for another moment. Then she offered a small smile. Not triumphant. Not resentful. Just kind. People make mistakes. Alexander nodded slowly. Some mistakes reveal more than others. The faint smile remained. What matters is whether they learn from them. Her answer surprised him. No lecture. No embarrassment. No attempt to make him feel smaller. Just a simple truth delivered with quiet dignity. And somehow that made the lesson impossible to ignore. For the second time that evening, Alexander found himself speechless. Not because Emily spoke another language, but because she understood something far more difficult. Character. Closing time arrived quietly. The last guests drifted into the night. The chandeliers dimmed slightly. Rain still fell beyond the tall windows, turning the streets of Manhattan into rivers of reflected light. Inside the Grand Meridian, the evening that had begun like any other was finally coming to an end. Emily finished organizing the final receipts and prepared to leave. Her shift had lasted nearly 13 hours. Her feet ached. Her shoulders felt heavy. Yet her expression remained calm. It always did. She gathered her coat from the employee locker room and stepped back into the dining area. Most of the staff had already gone home. A few remained cleaning tables and preparing for the next day. As Emily approached the exit, she noticed someone standing near the front windows. Alexander Hayes. He was still there, not checking his phone, not talking to assistants, not reviewing documents, simply standing alone, watching the rain. When he heard her footsteps, he turned. You are still here? Emily asked. Alexander smiled faintly. I could ask you the same thing. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander reached into his jacket and removed a business card. I know this is probably not the first offer you have received. Emily looked at the card but did not take it. Alexander continued. I would like you to come work for Hayes Technologies. Emily laughed softly. Not mockingly. Just surprised. You do not know anything about me. That is not true. Alexander looked at her carefully. I know you are intelligent. I know you stay calm under pressure. I know you solved a problem that experienced professionals missed. And I know every person at that table trusted your judgment within minutes of meeting you. Emily folded her arms gently. That is not a resume. No. Alexander nodded. It is something far more valuable. The rain tapped softly against the glass. Emily looked down at the business card, then back at him. Thank you, but I am not looking for a new job. Alexander seemed neither shocked nor disappointed, almost as if he expected the answer. May I ask why? Emily thought for a moment. Because not every opportunity is the right opportunity. Alexander smiled. That sounds exactly like something a successful executive would say. Maybe. She smiled back. Or maybe it is something a tired waitress says after a very long shift. They both laughed quietly. The tension that had defined their first interaction was completely gone. In its place stood something unexpected. Mutual respect. Finally, Alexander extended the card anyway. Keep it. Emily hesitated before accepting it. Why? Because if you ever decide you want a different path, I would like the chance to have that conversation. Emily slipped the card into her coat pocket. Fair enough. They walked toward the entrance together. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. The city shimmered beneath the streetlights. Before stepping through the door, Alexander stopped. There is one thing I still do not understand. Emily raised an eyebrow. Only one. He laughed. Why did you help me? The question lingered between them. Emily looked out toward the wet streets. Because it was the right thing to do. Even after what I said, she turned toward him. Her blue eyes were steady. Speaking another language is easy. Alexander listened carefully. Emily continued. Treating people with respect is harder. The words landed gently. Yet they carried more weight than any business lesson he had learned in years. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once. Slowly, thoughtfully, Emily stepped into the night and disappeared into the moving crowd of umbrellas and city lights. Alexander remained standing beneath the restaurant awning, watching until she was gone. Somewhere during that evening, a billionaire had entered believing status revealed a person's value. He left understanding something entirely different. Uniforms could hide brilliance. Silence could hide strength. And the most extraordinary, People were often the ones nobody bothered to notice. As the city continued moving around him, Alexander looked up at the rain-washed skyline and smiled. Because the most important agreement signed that night had never been written on paper. It was a lesson, one he would carry for the rest of his life. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary.